Holy Gospel according to St. Matthew, the 25th chapter.
Glory to you, Lord.
When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats, and he will put the sheep at his right hand and the goats at the left. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, "Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you?" And the king will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me." Then he will say to those at his left hand, "You that are accursed, depart from me, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me. Naked, and you did not give me clothing. Sick and in prison, and you did not visit me." Then they will also answer, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and did not take care of you?" Then he will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me." And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
A friend of mine shared this week that he'd been included on a mass text message from the higher-ups of the retail company where he works. The text, which was sent in preparation for the whirlwind of this shopping weekend, said in all caps, "Please always be aware that our guests may be company executives. We are to treat every guest as if they are." The gospel by text message, maybe. And I suppose if this week's text tells us anything, it's that Undercover Boss doesn't really have such an original premise after all. Or if we are among those getting in the spirit of the season that is coming already, there may be a carol or two that feels appropriate for a text like this. You better watch out. Seriously, a creepy song. Also a creepy idea. As kind of is part of this text. But apart from all that, it is one of the most fundamental claims of Christian faith, and perhaps one of the most radical, and probably also one of the hardest to live into, that God has been showing up in unexpected places from pretty much the beginning of time. And God still is. And for just about exactly that same length of time, people have been very good at not seeing things they aren't expecting to see or don't want to see, and vice versa. From the three strangers visiting Sarah and Abraham under the oaks of Mamre, to God's own self born to a poor, unwed teenager, we ought to know by now that God shows up in places we don't tend to think of godly, and that Christ is a different kind of king than we ever bargained for. But so often we are still surprised, or we just don't see what's right in front of us. And maybe sometimes we don't act accordingly. God shows up in unexpected places, dishonored places, forgotten places, less than holy, less than regal, less than obvious places. Maybe God has met you in a place like that. Maybe you even noticed. I know sometimes I have, and I'm also quite sure that more often I've missed it entirely. And so I wonder today, where are the unlikely places that Christ has been present in your life? There are some very difficult things about today's reading, but one part that I love unequivocally is that both those who served the Lord and those who didn't realize what they were doing. It makes me feel better that even those lifted up as examples of right living are a little bit clueless. It gives me hope. I'm kind of glad that even the people who offer clothing and food and care to the imprisoned and needy still had to ask Jesus what he meant when he praised them for it in the end. I'm glad they didn't really know what they were doing, because I don't really know what I'm doing a good bit of the time. And so hearing that doing my best without really fully understanding the implications might work out in spite of me in the end is comforting. Although the flip side is less so, because I do feel like it's just as likely that I don't know what I'm doing in one of those many ways where I fail to care for Jesus when he appears in my life. And the thing about it is, this isn't actually undercover boss or a corporate executive shopping in one of their stores on Black Friday. There isn't one Jesus hiding among thousands. It's not Where's Waldo. Jesus isn't saying he's going to test us someday and put on big sunglasses and a wig and sneak in here and see if we're doing okay. He's saying something even more amazing and kind of ridiculous than that. He's saying that whenever we do anything to or for the ones who are considered the least important, the least powerful, or the least worthwhile in this world, we are doing those things to and for him. Always. It's not a pop quiz. It's a daily truth. It's not actually so tricky, but it's still so hard to get right, which makes the end of the text all that much more disconcerting. And I'm not going to dwell on that because, well, I can't. I don't know how to tell sheep from goats very well. I took a quiz online this week, very much like the one that Mr. Ernie shared with the children, and I didn't do even as well as they did. It's much harder than I expected. I do know a few things about sheep and goats. I know they're both kept by the shepherd. I know they're both useful, both cared for. I know they're separated at night, mostly because goats need to be kept warmer and sheep like the open air better. I know that separating sheep from goats can be an act of love, too. And I have hope when I hear God speaking in Ezekiel about the kind of loving shepherd that God is, that there is redemption beyond this text, maybe for everyone in it, even the ones who don't do everything they should. But in the end, I also know that the judging part, the telling the difference part, isn't any of our job, and that we're not qualified for it anyway. So what I am going to dwell in, sitting with this text today, what I'm going to invite us all to dwell in, is what it might mean right now, on Christ the King Sunday in the year 2017, to expect to find Christ, our King, among the least considered, least loved, least honored ones in the world right now. I wonder who we think of when we think of who those people might be. And if we expected to find Christ there, if that would change our priorities at all, even in the middle of Christmas shopping and the demands of work or family or the other concerns of our life, which can draw the circles of our world so much smaller sometimes. It is as urgent as ever that we share in the work of caring for those that the world casts aside, however we are each called to do that. I'm also going to invite us to dwell in what it might mean right now on Christ the King Sunday in the year 2017 to be a subject of that King, of Christ first, of Christ only. When loyalty and authority carry such freight, when so much is demanded in so many forms from so many places in the world, what does it mean to be subject to the reign of Christ above everything else? Is it possible to do that and do everything else that is asked of us or expected of us without rocking the boat, without feeling a tension? I don't know. I think probably not. And it is easy for our ears to miss it, but this text that we have just heard about the Son of Man and the sheep and the goats and the final judgment isn't only about followers of Jesus. Jesus is speaking to his followers when he tells the story, but it's not just about them or about the Jewish people. Jesus says here that all the nations, which is the phrase Matthew uses generally to include and specifically speak of the Gentiles, of the non-Jewish people, all of the nations are to be gathered before the Son of Humanity in this final vision. So yet again, there is an us and a them that Jesus doesn't even countenance. The circle is always drawn wider than we expect, and Jesus marches across our territorialism and our tribalism always. His reign, his love, his concern, even maybe his judgment, it seems to some extent, extends so far beyond the groupings that we create to make ourselves feel comfortable, safe, worthwhile. Jesus is able to do the thing that this human family still struggles so much to do, and look at all the children of earth and say, you have a place within my purposes. You have worth. You have a call. This is about everyone and everything, and no one is outside this work or this worth. Today's gospel is many things. It is a call to live in love for those loved least. It is a reminder of one thing that is always true and yet so hard to allow to shape our lives, so hard to even fit inside our minds, that God is in this world. I think sometimes we jump so much to figuring out if we're responding in the right way to wherever Christ is hidden in our midst that we miss the first and startling thing, that God is here. God is in the ones considered the least of all. When we care for the least, we care for Christ. When we are the least, Christ inhabits our very life and breath with special favor and concern. Sometimes when we accept the love and care of others, we give them a chance to serve Christ. It is also a reminder that those we have dismissed or maybe considered outside our circle will stand before God too, that we are all children of the same heavenly parent. And we may be surprised to hear words of praise and thanks that Jesus has to offer to some of those who we had thought of as outsiders. Because the circle is always drawn wider, and in arcs our fingers cannot trace. The full unveiling of truth will come someday, and when that day comes, we will all stand in front of God, perplexed maybe at what we can't understand clearly yet. And in the meantime, we can look for God in this world, remembering that where we expect him the least, Christ our King is here with us. Thanks be to God. Amen.